and welcome to the McGowan Theater of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I'm Miriam Kleiman, the Program Director for Public Affairs. Before we get to today's talk, just a few promos. Please join us tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. as former members of Congress discuss The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis. Come back this Friday at noon to see the D.C. premiere of the film To Tell the Truth, Working for Change, a two-part history of documentary film in the U.S. and U.K. To learn more about upcoming programs and exhibits, please take a monthly calendar of events from the racks in the lobby as you leave, or go online to www.archives.gov/calendar. Consider joining the National Archives Foundation, the nonprofit that supports the work of the National Archives. There's membership applications, again, in the theater lobby right next to the calendar of events. Today's book talk is on The Nazis Next Door, How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men, by Eric Lichtblau. Eric Lichtblau is a New York Times investigative reporter here at the New York Times Bureau in D.C. He started at the LA Times and joined the New York Times in 2002. He's been there ever since, garnering many awards, including a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for breaking the story of the NSA's secret wiretapping in the weeks after 9/11. He's appeared on C-SPAN, CNN, PBS, and every news show you've heard of, and many you haven't. In his free time, he's written 2 books, Bush's Law, The Remaking of American Justice, and the one he's here to talk about today. This book is truly a page-turner. Drama and intrigue, government agency fighting government agency, good versus evil, and the pervasive question, should these elderly Nazi war criminals be brought to justice, or is it time to just move on? I found this book fascinating, starting with the cover. I'm from Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland, home to John Demjanjuk, literally, well, not literally the Nazi next door, but the Nazi across the city. I was in elementary school when he was first identified as Ivan the Terrible. The man was evil incarnate, and I remember following the case for many years. In college, many years later, I studied in Jerusalem and attended his trial there, where clearly he was so accustomed to court trials that he seemed cordial and almost jovial during the proceedings. Lichtblau outlines the permutations of this case that ended just 2 years ago, with Demjanjuk's death in Germany during yet another appeal. I also found the book of great interest because my first job with the archives was as a researcher with the Nazi War Crimes Interagency Working Group, the archives-based group that helped declassify the backlog of Nazi war crimes-related records. Thank you for citing many of our group's reports. One last plug. You too can be an investigative reporter. The National Archives holds millions of records relating to the Third Reich, the Holocaust, Nuremberg war crimes trials, and Operation Paperclip. There are stories waiting to be told and books to be written, but I don't know if any will be as gripping as the one we're here to hear about today. Please join me in welcoming Eric Lichtblau to the National Archives.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Miriam. It's great to be here today, and it's especially nice to be here at the National Archives. I could not echo more strongly what Miriam said about the vast resources that the National Archives has. I did much of my research up in College Park at the facility there, and if you've never been there, I know by your presence today, you're all interested in history and research. I would urge you to go up there, pick a subject, and rummage through history, basically. We've gotten to the point where we think everything is searchable on Google in 0.23 seconds, and it ain't so. There are millions and millions of records in the National Archives, and this book would not be anywhere near the form it is now were it not for a lot of the declassified war crime files that Miriam mentioned, which Congress ordered the intelligence agencies to begin producing in 1999 about the government's relationships with known Nazi war criminals. And it's really, the facility in College Park at the National Archives, it's really a throwback. When you're, you got to wait. It's sort of like the old Heinz ketchup commercial. You got to wait a couple hours usually to request the documents. But once you get back those boxes of documents on the original parchments, when you're looking at files from 1945, 46, 47, about conversations between the Pentagon and the State Department about Nazis, as a researcher, it was a real thrill. And again, this book would not have been possible without the National Archives and the archives that are available in College Park. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about how this book started. It was really by accident almost with a tip that I got now about 4 years ago from a source of mine who said that there was this internal report at the Justice Department that laid out the history of the Nazi hunting unit at the Justice Department, which was created in 1979. This was this exhaustive internal history, 600 pages or so, warts and all, which looked not only at how the United States had belatedly tried to identify and deport Nazi fugitives in the United States, but also how, even more interestingly, how the U.S. government itself had relations with some of these guys beginning immediately after the war. Now, for reasons that were still mysterious when I got this tip, the government had refused to put it out. They had been sitting on the report for years. And if you know any reporters in Washington, the surefire way to get a reporter's attention is by telling him that the government has a secret report that they are not going to share publicly. That is like waving a slab of meat in the face of a hungry dog. And I was determined to try and get a hold of this report. And eventually I did. I was able to get it. The Justice Department didn't want it out, but it became a front page story in the New York Times. I should say that the author of that report happens to be sitting here, Judy Fagan, who deserves a lot of credit for putting together really the first comprehensive history of this period. And if the FBI leak investigators are listening on YouTube, Judy was not the source of that story. I want to make clear that she was not behind that, although she, again, deserves credit for the work that she put into that stuff. So just looking at the details in this report that really stuck with me, I remember there was a detail about a Justice Department official who kept in his desk drawer a piece of Mengele's scalp, or what was thought to be Mengele's scalp in the years before DNA, because they wanted to try and be able to confirm, was that really Mengele who had died in Bolivia years before? There were all these titillating details, and I think before I even finished writing the story and before it even appeared in the New York Times, I knew that there had to be more here, and that this was a topic worthy of an even more exhaustive examination, and that there was a book to be written here. And that's how I came to write a book about what I consider to be one of the most shameful yet little-known periods in post-war history. And that's the story of the exodus of the Nazis, the flight of thousands of Nazis into the United States after the war, as many as 10,000 by some estimates. And this book, as much as anything else, is about debunking myths. Myths that have grown large because of Hollywood films and urban legends and plain and simple misinformation over the years. Myths, for instance, that all or most of the major war criminals in the Nazi regime were brought to justice at Nuremberg. Myths that those few who did get away ended up in Latin America, in Argentina or Bolivia or Ecuador. And myths that of that group that some Americans think they know about, the Nazi rocketeers who ended up in places like Alabama, were really just Nazis in name only and had no real connection to the atrocities that we associate with the Nazi regime. This book is aimed at shedding light on this period and putting to rest some of the misinformation that surrounds the Nazi period. I tell the story in the book about Alan Dulles, who you see here, with John F. Kennedy. Allen Dulles, the brother of John Foster Dulles, was the first CIA director beginning in the 1950s under Eisenhower. Before that, though, he was a top intelligence official for the OSS, the predecessor agency to the CIA, in Switzerland. And there's sort of a seminal moment that I used to lead off the book, where Allen Dulles, while the war was still going on in early 1945, met with a leading Nazi general, a general by the name of Karl Wolff, who you see here on the left, with his boss, Heinrich Himmler, the notorious SS chief. And while the bullets were still flying in Germany, months before Germany's ultimate surrender, Dulles met with General Wolff at a safe house in Zurich. He didn't arrest him, didn't put hands on him, didn't accuse him or confront him with his war crimes. Instead, they sipped scotch by a fireside and spoke in German about mutual acquaintances, because Dulles thought that Wolff, who controlled a lot of the SS men in Italy at that time, would have the power to perhaps effectuate an early surrender in Italy, ahead of Germany itself. By that point, everyone knew that Hitler was about to be defeated. It was just a question of when, and in fact, they did get the men in Italy to surrender a few weeks earlier than everyone else. But Dulles also wanted something else that really forms the framework of my book, and that is an asset in this brave new Cold War that he and other U.S. Cold Warriors are about to embark on. He saw Himmler's chief of staff, General Wolff, as someone who knew the Soviets, who loathed and despised the Soviets, and could exploit that hatred and knowledge to wage battle with the Soviets, even before the war against Germany was over. Soviets, of course, remember, were at least on paper, our ally at the end of the war, but people like Dulles were already looking ahead to the next Cold War. And for years after the war, Dulles would, in fact, protect General Wolff from war crimes charges. Rather than being a defendant at Nuremberg, as he was originally listed, Wolff instead became a witness to the war crimes in which he himself had engaged. This was a man who had helped set up the train network through Europe that brought millions to their deaths at the gas chambers. And yet, listen to how Allen Dulles described General Wolff, Nazi General Wolff, the very next day after that meeting that I spoke of in Zurich, in a cable that he sent back to Washington, to the OSS leaders, a secret classified cable, which was declassified and is now available at the National Archives. This is how Allen Dulles described the Nazi general. He said, I'm sorry, let me just grab the page here. Okay, I apologize. I've lost the page here for a second. Okay, the very next day he sent a secret telegram to Washington recapping what he excitedly viewed as a breakthrough meeting with Nazi General Wolff. Much of the memo was devoted to how impressed he was with the Nazi general, a rose-colored view that ignored the many atrocities he had directed. Quote, "Wolff is a distinctive personality," Dulles wrote, "and dynamic, too. Our reports and impressions indicate he represents more moderate elements in the Waffen-SS with a mixture of romanticism. The general's aim," Dulles cabled, "was to help lead Germany out of war and to end useless material and human destruction," end quote. Wolff was handsome and trustworthy too, Dulles added later, and the Allies would be able to work with him. Those who had met him could plainly see that Wolff was, quote, "no ogre," unquote. Dulles was also impressed with the Nazi general's deputies. This is how he described one of the top deputies who helped arrange that secret meeting in Zurich, a man by the name of Guido Zimmer, who was a senior officer in the SS under Wolff. He said that Zimmer, quote, "despite his membership in the SS, was a devout Catholic. Zimmer, somewhat of an aesthete and intellectual, was moved by a desire to save the art and religious treasures of Italy from ruin if the war continued. Zimmer seemed to be a misfit in the SS. He was good-looking, clean-cut, not the way one pictures the typical SS officer." So this was a mindset that you saw not only with Dulles, but with other senior American leaders at that time as we entered the Cold War, beginning at the end of 1945. Another figure who plays a major part at the outset of the post-war period was General Patton, who you see here with General Eisenhower at the close of the war. Now, General Patton ran the displaced persons camps where hundreds of thousands of people were kept, war refugees alongside Nazi POWs, while the world basically tried to figure out what to do with them. And Patton, of course, was by that point a noted war hero, old blood and guts they called him. He's now also the subject of a best-selling book by Bill O'Reilly. He's remembered quite fondly in most circles. I tell this story in the book. In that period in the displaced person camps, General Patton going to the POW barracks where some of the Nazi scientists were kept. These were men who had built the V-2 rockets that Hitler had used to strafe Europe, Antwerp, London, and elsewhere, doing massive destruction. At that point, they were considered a technological marvel. The Germans were doing things with the rockets that no one else had managed to do. Patton went to the barracks and hunted out the top general in charge of that operation, a man by the name of Walter Dornberger. And he called him out of the barracks and he said, "Are you Dornberger?" And Dornberger said, "Jawohl, Herr General." And Patton said to him, "You're the one who built the V-2 rockets?" And again, Dornberger said, "Jawohl, Herr General." And Patton took out of his pocket 3 cigars and handed them to Dornberger and said, "Well, congratulations, we couldn't have done it." And Patton had this odd, almost admiring view of the Nazis, and that played itself out not only in his admiration for people like General Dornberger and under him the now famous Werner von Braun, but also the rank-and-file Nazis who were kept in these DP camps. Believe it or not, and this has now been essentially lost to history, and it was surprising to me in my research, Patton let the Nazi officers maintain control of a number of the displaced person camps, essentially lording over the Jews under them. They were either bunked side by side with them or at times were giving them orders as to how the camps would be run. And Patton believed that they were in the best position to run the camps because of the efficiency that they had brought to the war. That sounds unbelievable 60, 70 years later, that could be the mindset, but it was. In fact, he defied the orders from General Eisenhower, again, you see the two of them here together, to denazify the camps. And he told one of his aides, when he was challenged about this, if those are the men best positioned to do the job, I want them to do it. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that this admiration for the Nazis didn't have a spillover effect on the treatment of the real victims here, the Jews, because also lost to history is the fact that Patton was a raging anti-Semite, and he held the prisoners in those camps, the Jews chiefly, in utter disdain. You see here a report that was prepared for President Truman when General Eisenhower and General Patton under him were running those displaced person camps about 6 months after the end of the war, when hundreds of thousands of refugees were kept in those camps. Not just Jews, but communists, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, large classes of other persecuted victims who had somehow survived Hitler's killing machine. And yet, Truman's report, which was prepared by the dean of the University of Pennsylvania, told him that the conditions in those camps were so decrepit and so unlivable and so horrific to the point that people were not only dying of dysentery and other diseases, but some were actually committing suicide under the U.S. watch, that he compared them to the camps that the Nazi concentration, that the Nazis had run themselves. He said, this is a man by the name of Earl Harrison who wrote the report, he said, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy." Now, Patton, when he got this report from Truman, was outraged. This was obviously an attack on his own management of the camps. He essentially doubled down. What he wrote in his diary after that, a copy of which are in the archives at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, where I did a fellowship during my research, what he wrote in his journal was this: "Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals. Laying bare the rabid anti-Semitism that infected the American refugee effort, Patton complained of how the Jews in one DP camp, with, quote, no sense of human relationships, end quote, would defecate on the floors and live in filth like lazy locusts. He told of taking General Eisenhower to tour a makeshift synagogue that the Jews in the camp had set up to celebrate the holy day of Yom Kippur. Quote, we entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking mass of humanity I have ever seen. This was Eisenhower's first glimpse of the DPs, Patton wrote, so it was all new to him. Quote, of course, I have seen them since the beginning and marveled that beings alleged to be made in the form of God can look the way they do or act the way they act. So what effect did this have on the Nazis getting into America? Well, it had huge ramifications because as easy as it was for the Nazis to get out of Europe, it was that much more difficult for the true victims to get out of those concentration camps. In those early months and years after the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, visas to America and elsewhere around the world were in precious short supply. They were essentially a golden ticket out of this horrific war zone. And at that point, there were only a few thousand visas available for Jewish survivors in the concentration camps to come to America. And Palestine was equally inaccessible to many of them, despite attempts early on to make that a safe haven for the legitimate refugees, for the survivors who were in those concentration camps. And yet, at that same time, there were 400,000 visas that were available to refugees from Eastern Europe, from the so-called captive nation states that had been occupied by the Nazis. And this was all a part of this Cold War thinking that I mentioned. These were people who were seen as having been captive by the Nazis for the last several years and were about to be seized essentially by the Soviet Union. We wanted to get those people in the United States before the Soviets could get their hands on them. Many of these refugees were seen as staunch anti-communists, people who would make good Americans. That you can look in the congressional record about the immigration policies and you see them describing Estonians and Lithuanians and Latvians as people of good stock, of good breeding, who would make good Americans. So while we were shutting the doors to the Jews and the other survivors in Germany itself, we were opening the floodgates from Eastern Europe. Now, of those 400,000, no doubt the vast majority were legitimate war refugees in every sense of the word, people who had just been victimized once and were about to be victimized again as part of the Soviet Empire and the loss of their human rights and dignity. But it's also clear that among those 400,000, there was a not insignificant number, probably upwards of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, who were Nazi collaborators, senior Nazi collaborators, who were not captives of the Nazis in any sense, but were their willing partners, their willing executioners, if you will, who had led concentration camps, who had been directly involved in execution squads, in commando raids in villages, in persecution at the worst levels. They were people like Karl Linnaeus, who was a police official who ran a Nazi concentration camp in Tartu, Estonia, where thousands and thousands of Jews were shot to death on his orders at a death pit just inside the camp. Linnaeus was the one who would lead the school children from a bus upon their arrival to the edge of the pit in their underwear as they were about to be shot dead. And he had this odd, macabre habit of taking their personal belongings, dolls and clothing, and putting it in a pile. That he would save, but he wouldn't save the children. Karl Linnaeus was one of those refugees who got into America, lived on Long Island for the better part of 30 years before anyone realized who he was and what he had done in that long ago war. There were also men like Jacob Reimer, a Ukrainian who settled in Queens and made a good living selling potato chips. His visa application put him down as a POW during the war. It left out some of the more haunting aspects of his Nazi service, such as serving as a decorated officer in the SS, taking part in raids in Jewish villages, and training guards at Travnicki, the infamous Nazi concentration camp. Half a century later, the Justice Department prosecutors belatedly came after Reimer to deport him for his role with the Nazis. This was how one of the prosecutors explained the math of post-war immigration policies to the judge. Quote, Reimer was never entitled to immigrate to America. There were only a limited number of visas back then, and he took the visa of a real victim. One more Nazi in America meant one fewer victim who got to come to America and enjoy the freedom and liberties that it offered them. But there were others who didn't need to sneak in like Jacob Reimer or Karl Linnaeus. They were people like Otto von Bolshevik, a Prussian baron who was a senior SS officer. He had help from the CIA. The CIA knew of his role with the Nazis, and yet in the 1950s hired him anyway as a spy, making about $1,700 a month plus a carton of cigarettes, in Austria to spy on the Soviets as part of this new Cold War. Now, von Bolshevik, like many of the other Nazi spies hired by US intelligence services, was not a particularly good spy. It probably won't shock anyone in this room that the Nazis who we recruited as spies against the Soviets turned out often to be embezzlers, thieves, cheats, liars, and even on occasion Soviet double agents. But at the time, this did not seem apparent to the US intelligence officials who hired them. And in fact, von Bolshevik, I tell the story in the book of his being dispatched on a train to deliver a satchel filled with spy photos and documents with the names of secret agents to a contact in Hamburg, except that he reached this destination at the end of the train and he realized that he had mixed up his bag with another person's. And instead of the spy documents inside, there were pajamas and men's toiletries. Now, if that were you or I, who was caught in such an embarrassing episode, not to mention the fact that we used to be a Nazi, the CIA would probably fire us, I'm fairly confident. Yet von Bolshevik, not only wasn't he fired, but the CIA whitewashed his record and brought him and his family to New York City to live as what they called a quote-unquote reward for his service in Austria. That's their word, not mine, because I can't make this stuff up. And in view of what they called the, quote, innocuousness of his Nazi party activities. Now, innocuousness is a strange word to use when you're talking about a man who worked as a top aide before the war to this man, who you may recognize as Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. Von Bolshevik was the man who wrote in the years before the war hideous white papers for the Jewish Affairs Office, for Eichmann's eyes and others, about the ways to terrorize Jews. This is a sample of his writing of a paper called The Jewish Problem. So von Bolshevik wrote that a largely anti-Jewish atmosphere must be created among the people in order to form the basis for the continued attack and the effective exclusion of them. The most effective means is the anger of the people leading to excesses in order to take away the sense of security from the Jews. Even though this is an illegal method, it has had a long-standing effect. The Jew has learned a lot through the pogroms of the past centuries and fears nothing as much as a hostile atmosphere which can go spontaneously against him at any time. Now, the CIA had in its own files evidence linking von Bolshevik directly to Nazi party activities at the highest levels. And yet, they not only brought him to the United States to live with his family, but they even covered up his activities years later when von Bolshevik was in some danger of being exposed. His old boss, Adolf Eichmann, you may recall, was captured by the Israelis in Argentina in 1960, a daring raid that brought headlines around the world to the problem of Nazi fugitives. And von Bolshevik himself feared that he was going to be next. So he went back to the CIA, and I tell the story in the book of a meeting that they held in New York City at a restaurant where the CIA promised him that they would protect him. They would not tell the Israelis who he was or where he was. They would not tell the Justice Department immigration officials. They would not tell anyone. And in fact, it worked. They kept his secret for another 20 years until the Justice Department finally realized who he was. By that point, he was living in Northern California. And on his deathbed, he was finally confronted with his horrible crimes. This is another CIA spy from the Nazi regime. His name is Aleksandras Lelekas, who was a Lithuanian. You see him on the left. That's a picture of him in 1938 when he was the head of a notorious Lithuanian security force in Vilnius that worked hand in hand with the Gestapo in the Nazi-occupied country of Lithuania to identify, arrest, and ultimately slaughter 60,000 Jews outside the town of Vilnius. This is a picture of some of the victims, a small fraction of the victims. And Lelekas was the one who would sign the warrants imprisoning women, children, and some men, but mostly women and children, in the local prison, and then handing them over to the Gestapo, where they would be led outside to a killing field and machine gunned to death. You see on the right his photo in the United States after he'd become a naturalized U.S. citizen living in Massachusetts. He too was a CIA agent in those years after the war, working for the CIA in Europe as an asset in the Cold War. It was not as if the CIA did not know of his past. In fact, the files at the National Archives in College Park, you can read where the CIA, within months of the end of the war, had determined that Lelekas was, quote, controlled by the Gestapo, end quote, in Lithuania, and was connected to the mass shootings in Vilnius. And yet they used him as a Cold War spy in Europe in the 1950s, paying him a handsome salary, plus, of course, cigarettes, and then helped him move to Massachusetts, where, like Otto von Bolshevik, he lived for years and years before he was ever confronted with his crimes. He managed to fade into the Lithuanian community. He sold encyclopedias for a living, and it was another 30 years before he was facing deportation for his crimes. I'll show you one last Nazi fugitive who lived right here in Washington. This was a man by the name of Walter Hilger, who was not anonymous by any means. This was one of Hitler's top foreign policy aides, the number 2 man on Soviet affairs to General Ribbentrop, who was executed in Nuremberg. Hilger, in fact, was with Hitler towards the end of the war in one of the eastern bunkers and was a top advisor on the invasion of Russia by the Germans earlier in the war. He came to Washington. He worked for the CIA as a covert analyst. He would go out to McLean. And in fact, I tell the story in the book of how he would do research here at the National Archives on a regular basis in the 1950s. And seemed to be hiding in plain sight. He was listed in the telephone book. He was writing his memoirs in which he talked unapologetically about having served Hitler. There was another man doing research at the National Archives in that time, a man by the name of Raoul Hillman, who was writing what became the definitive work on the Holocaust, the destruction of the European Jews. And he would see Hilger sometimes sitting at the cubicle at the National Archives, and he knew that no one was paying any attention to him, but he refused to be in the same room with him. So whenever he saw him, he, in a sort of silent protest, would stand up and leave. That was about the best that he could hope for as a denunciation of the presence of Hilger and people like him in the United States. I'll show you one more picture. I'll talk just quickly, and then I think we'll open it up to questions about the Nazi scientists. I talked about the mythologizing of the Nazi scientists and the idea that these were Nazis in name only. This is a picture of a group of them in San Antonio after the war. Werner von Braun is on the right, and to the left is a guy by the name of Arthur Rudolph, who you see here with his Nazi identification card on the swastikas. Now, Nazi in name only for Rudolph and von Braun and many others like them meant that they operated a hideous slave labor factory camp in Nordhausen, Germany, where thousands of prisoners, mostly POWs from France, Russia, Poland, and elsewhere, died from disease, from malnutrition, from other ailments. And if you were suspected of sabotaging the rocket parts that they were building for their V-2, you were brought to the center of the factory where a giant crane was set up for the work. And you were hanged in front of the other prisoners as a lesson of what would become you if you dared to mess with the Nazi machinery. Arthur Rudolph was the head of production at that facility. Yet he, like von Braun, came to America under what was known as Operation Paperclip and lived for years, not only as a free American, but as a noted NASA scientist, not quite as famous as Werner von Braun, but within the Apollo space program and the Saturn space program, he was quite prominent. And it wasn't until the 1980s, as in the case we saw with Otto von Bolshevik and Alexander Lelekas and others, that the Justice Department finally came after him and he was allowed to return to Germany, where he lived out his life. There are obviously a lot of villains in this book, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that there are no heroes. One of them was a man I'd never heard of before I started my research, a man by the name of Chuck Allen, you see here on the left. He was a left-wing journalist in the 1960s. He wrote for obscure communist publications and Jewish publications. Occasionally he would get into a prominent left-wing publication like The Nation, but for the most part no one read his stuff. No one except for the FBI, because Chuck Allen was writing about Nazis in America long before anyone else, before anyone was even aware that this was an issue. In 1963, he published a 40-page expose naming names, including Walter Hilger, the person I showed you a minute ago, the foreign affairs specialist, and others, of people who were living here in the United States and living freely as Americans despite their war crimes. He was sort of a journalist / activist, and you see on the right a poster from a rally that he organized. He organized rallies in Brooklyn and Chicago and Los Angeles to draw attention to this problem. Now, as I said, the mainstream media and politicians, for the most part, ignored him, but the FBI didn't. J. Edgar Hoover considered him such a threat to national security because he was writing about this unpopular issue that he approved a warrant to wiretap him in the 1960s and surveil him as he went around to Eastern European countries to gather evidence against people in the United States and their war crimes. So the FBI and the Justice Department not only didn't act on his findings, many of which turned out to be quite factual and well-founded, but they retaliated against him by declaring him a communist subversive and a national security threat. And it wasn't until 20 years later, in the early 1980s, that the Justice Department again, belatedly began going after these guys and identifying more than 130 who they actually ended up prosecuting in the United States. But by then, these guys were in their 60s and 70s. Some of them had died already. A lot of them were in failing health by then. And it was, unfortunately, a tragic situation of too little, too late by the time the United States realized the Nazi problem it had in its own backyard. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. Thank you very much. Yes, just jump in.
These days, post-traumatic stress keeps coming up by people who behaved in relatively benign things during the war and it caused severe psychological damage for them. I never hear about that with Nazi refugees. Was there, do you have any evidence that any Nazi sat there and thought, yeah, that was a mistake?
What did I do? No, for the most part, they really just faded into the woodwork. I mean, obviously, these were people who had every reason to hide their pasts. They did not want to draw attention to themselves. Very few of them ever had run-ins with the law. There was one guy who got into a shooting, but he was the exception. These were not, guys who were on the verge of a breakdown over confronting their pasts or anything like that. And for the most part, they lived remarkably unremarkable lives. Yes?
I wanted to comment on your last question about the Justice Department finally
Yes.
going after them, and I'm a little confused on that based on the historical aspects of the U.S. government having an agenda and bringing people in some format and then having those people have some type of protection
Right.
that then later evaporated. What laws historically, I guess, exists to say these people are pawns and useful to us at one point, and later in their lives they're expendable?
Right. Well, what happened beginning in the late 1970s that led up to the Justice Department finally going after a number of these guys in the 1980s was that you had members of Congress, most notably Elizabeth Holtzman, who began holding hearings, began hearing about lists of people inside the United States with Nazi ties and drawing public attention to this problem in a way that had never happened before. That led Congress to create a whole new office at the Justice Department, the Office of Special Investigations in 1979, with a fairly large team of investigators and historians and lawyers, and to try and prosecute and deport as many of them as they can. They ran into all sorts of legal troubles, first of all, because there was no war crime statute on the books that you could apply retroactively to the war crimes of Nazis living in the United States. In fact, they had to go back and pass what was called the Holtzman Amendment to specifically say you could deport Nazi persecutors. That was how sort of jigsaw the law had become in terms of their ability to go after these people. And the role that some of these guys had played with the CIA and other intelligence agencies was a huge obstacle. The Justice Department probably didn't realize at the time just quite how much interference they were facing, but the records on file at the National Archives now show that there were repeated cases of obstruction by the CIA, where they were whitewashing these guys' records, they were hiding witnesses, they were reporting to the Justice Department and the INS that so-and-so, there was no derogatory information in their files on so-and-so, when in fact they had all sorts of derogatory information showing that these people were Nazis. So you're left to wonder not only what would have happened if the government had gone after these guys 25, 30 years earlier, but what would have happened even in 1980 if the CIA and other agencies had been less obstructive and more forthcoming about what they knew. Yes?
I have a question, because you keep saying the CIA, but I'd really like to know who in the CIA was pushing this agenda and who are the culprits, and does your book go into exposing like who really were the people doing this policy?
I mean, Alan Dulles, I think, was the main one who we talked about earlier, who really championed this Cold War mindset of using Nazis, no matter their pasts, if it could help the United States. After his meeting with, I'm trying to get back to, sorry about that, there we go. After his meeting with General Wolfe that I mentioned, he wrote in his own memoir unapologetically about having met with a Nazi general. He said, I would meet with the devil himself if it would help me win the war. And the new war was the Cold War, and Dulles certainly was the one behind using a number of these guys, including many who I haven't even mentioned, and not only using them, but then protecting them later when there was a threat of exposure. On a rare occasion, once or twice in the 1950s, publicity would come up about a particular Nazi living in the United States who worked for the CIA, and under Dulles, the CIA, in one case, took the guy out of the country and dropped him in Argentina. So I think it really started from Dulles on down, and there were people under him. There were memo after memo. I focus several chapters in the book on a CIA operative by the name of Tom Subsakoff, who lived in New Jersey and had been the head of a Nazi execution squad. And there are hundreds of pages of files where the CIA is aware of his own admissions of his role with the Nazis, but they dismiss them as what they call minor war crimes. And that was a phrase I found so stunning that I made that the title of one chapter, Minor War Crimes, because in the view of Dulles and people under him, whatever they may have been involved in with the Nazis was outweighed by their supposed value in the Cold War, even if that supposed value meant getting your satchel of spy photos mixed up with men's toiletry bag. Yes?
I remember my parents and grandparents talking about Nazi cells in Chicago and Minneapolis, where I was from. Was there anything that you discovered in your research, I realize it's outside the purview of your book, that would link any of these men to any of those or any of that conglomeration to what we have now as neo-Nazi organizations in the United States or around the world?
Yeah, I did look at that, and I think the answer is that there was no direct connections that I ever found in Chicago, Skokie, or anywhere else. But the real Nazis were sort of an inspiration to the neo-Nazis years later. But it's not as if the Otto Von Bolsheviks and the other people were out, leading Nazi marches with swastikas. They wanted to lay low. They wanted as little to do with their past as possible. So they weren't going to be out there with the skinheads. If they were, I didn't find it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Right. My focus was on the United States, so I didn't look nearly as in-depth at other countries, but certainly Argentina, and several other countries in Latin America did have historically a lot of complicity. The supposed rat line, as it was called, out of Europe and Italy after the war, went directly to Argentina, and there were, Eichmann obviously was the biggest name among them. There were even countries in Europe, we have this image of the Nazis fleeing Europe. In fact, many of them stayed in Europe and were protected in Italy and elsewhere by governments that, while perhaps not openly scornful, were accepting of their staying there.
We talk about the Nazis and the war crimes they did, but obviously the Japanese had people, the Stalinists had people. Did we do similar programs to rescue, so to speak, war criminals from other theaters and other conflicts? Is this the tip of an iceberg?
That's a great question. There's probably another book in that. I've had that thought because the war crime files that Miriam talked about, the National Archives, I don't know what the breakdown is, but if half of them are about Nazis, probably the other half, maybe not quite half, are about Japanese war criminals. And I'm not aware that there's been nearly as much research into that side of the collection as there has been into the Nazi side. And God knows what would be in there. So, and Mary, has there been a real exhaustive look at the Japanese side of the war crime files? Yeah, I don't think so. So someone should take a crack at it. So. Let's see, anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, did you, so have you come to any conclusions? I mean, the Cold War obviously came very rapidly on the heels of World War II. As you look at it now, were these efforts, the CIA and whatnot, were they productive? Did they lead to,
Yeah, I've been asked that question before, and as I talked about with the story about the lost satchel, there are certainly many cases of bumbling or worse in the Nazi spies. A few of them turned out to be Soviet double agents who were not only paid for their work by the United States, despite their Nazi past, but then were giving information to the Soviets and disinformation to the United States. I mean, there certainly were some who were of value. Probably the biggest example is Reinhard Gellen's organization. He was a Nazi general who set up a whole spy network out of Europe, mainly a lot of Austrians. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of ex-Nazis in his spy network. And he was so successful at sort of using the United States. They brought him, in 1951, they brought him to New York and sort of rolled out the red carpet for him to try and get him on our side, even though he had been a Nazi general 6 years earlier. They took him to Yankee Stadium to see Mickey Mantle in the World Series and paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars in those first few years. I think it was over $2 million, I think, in the end, from the military and the CIA. And yet he sort of viewed them with disdain. He wouldn't even tell the United States who the men in his network were, their real identities, and it come to find out many of them were fellow Nazis like himself, involved in war crimes. And he went on to become the head of the West German intelligence service, partly through the apparatus that he had set up under the Americans. So I think there's no doubt that he had a legitimate spy network and was passing what turned out to be valuable information to the United States. But whether it was mostly valuable, mostly damaging, it's tough to say. Certainly there's enough cases of ineptitude to call it all into question. And there's obviously the bigger moral issue of, let's assume for a second that the information was valuable, at what price, given the histories of these guys? How far are you willing to go morally and ethically to get intelligence?
Isn't that easy to say today versus back then?
Certainly, yes. It was a different time, and it's easy to sort of look back at the Cold War and say, it was overinflamed and the rhetoric didn't match the real danger. But sure, I didn't live through the most heated moments, so But sure, I acknowledge that you know, in 1955 and 1959 and 1962, there was a different mindset. And I think that's what we saw here. Anyone else? Was there one up front? No. Oh, okay.
As you alluded to, probably the most famous was von Braun and the scientists. Did you run into any research or information about how much knowledge von Braun actually had of the war crimes that were committed when they're building the V-2? We know that built by Jewish slave labor, those rockets, but how much knowledge he actually had of that? Or I guess he would have had to.
Yeah, no, I did look at that, and other historians before me have also looked at that. Michael Neufeld at the Smithsonian who wrote a great book just about von Braun and his role. And I looked at the archives at von Braun's role. It's clear beyond any doubt that he knew that there were thousands of slave laborers who were building his rockets in this horrible mountain factory. And that they were dying on a regular basis. And in fact, von Braun was the one who would meet with the SS along with other senior scientists and tell them how many more prisoners of war he needed sent to the factory because X hundred had just died that week. So there are notes of meetings at which von Braun was essentially requisitioning prisoners of war to build his rockets. And he himself visited the plant. He wasn't based at that factory, but he visited there somewhere from 12 to 15 times. And he said, well, everything seemed fine from what I saw. He didn't see any signs of real misery. And Arthur Rudolph, the scientist I mentioned who actually did work at the site, he was the head of production, you know, he gave similar unbelievable accounts of having there's Arthur Rudolph there, of having toured the facility. And, you know, what the SS did with the prisoners wasn't really his problem. They seemed to be eating well. They were eating better than him. You know, some people were dying, but that happened. When he was finally confronted in 1981, he gives this remarkable account of his role in the camps in overseeing the slave production. And I tell the story. You still need to read the book and see how it all played out, but I'll tell you, I'll cut to the end anyway, but of how one of the Justice Department Nazi hunters, Eli Rosenbaum, first got on to Arthur Rudolph and first realized that he was in the United States when he read an account out of Europe about Rudolph being annoyed to have to leave a New Year's Eve party at the factory because there was a problem with the workers and they couldn't transport one of the V2s on time. And in a sort of complaining fashion, Rudolph said it spoiled his New Year's Eve and what a drag this was. And Eli Rosenbaum read this and then came to find out that he was living in the United States and was at that point a fairly well-known Nassau scientist. And that led to this years-long hunt to bring evidence against him and finally force him out of the country. And Rudolph reported to von Braun. Von Braun was his boss, and Rudolph was basically his production engineer on the ground. So,
what happened to von Braun?
Von Braun died a few years before that Justice Department office was opened. He died in 1977. But there was a lot of talk at the Justice Department just a few years after that. What would have happened if he were still alive? And would they have gone after someone that senior who had, you know, presidents on his speed dial and access to every policymaker in Washington? But they certainly gathered evidence after that, even after he passed away, of his own role in complicity. They went after Arthur Rudolph here, his top deputy. But I make the case in the book that there was really a backlash over the case against Rudolph within the Reagan White House. Pat Buchanan, in particular, was a fierce critic of the Nazi hunters, what he called the hairy-chested Nazi hunters at the Justice Department. And Arthur Rudolph became the first and last scientist to be prosecuted by the Justice Department. There were evidentiary problems. There were, obviously, it had been many years since the crimes themselves had been committed, but there was also clearly a political backlash that made it, I believe, more difficult to bring a number of these cases. At one point, they had upwards of a dozen case files open in the 1980s into fellow Nazi scientists, along with Arthur Rudolph, and these were almost equally well-known people in Alabama and Texas, and yet none of those people were ever prosecuted.
May I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
During the immediate post-war period, West Germany did the same thing.
Sure.
What did you find in your research between our government and that government?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of interesting conversations that I include in the book where Americans would be talking to the Soviets and the East Germans about their own war criminals. You know, part of the Cold War race and the race to get a hold of people like Arthur Rudolph and Werner von Braun was to beat the Soviets to them, because the Soviets were actively recruiting Nazi scientists, and there were reports that they were even kidnapping some of them. So we wanted to get at them first. The Americans would occasionally have interaction with their communist counterparts and ask them, well, what would you do with Nazi war criminals when you got them? And there's one telling conversation I recount where an East German says to someone at the Justice Department, well, you know, we used them and we shot them. That was their approach. In West Germany, yeah, I was in East Germany. West Germany, well, I talked about Reinhard Gehlen, who went on to become the intelligence chief. You know, West Germany obviously went through a tortured period of denazification and purged some, but clearly not all of top Nazi leaders. You know, what happened in the years immediately after the war, the United States and the other allies prosecuted hundreds and hundreds of people at Nuremberg. But we sort of grew tired of that, which I hadn't realized before I started my research. And the West Germans made it pretty clear by 1950, you know, Korea was heating up, and we wanted the West Germans' help in Korea. And they made it pretty clear, like, if you want our help with these communists, you better stop prosecuting war criminals. And not only do we stop prosecuting them around 1949 or 1950, but the United States then pardoned dozens and dozens of them. They literally freed them from prison and wiped clean the record of many others in response really to pressure from the Germans, who had, you know, grown tired of this whole war crimes business. We're out of time. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.